If politics is about power, then transformation is about survival. But what happens when a man reinvents himself so completely that even his past begins to look like a contradiction? In America, few political figures have sparked as much debate over authenticity, loyalty, and ambition as JD Vance. Some call him a voice for forgotten America. Others call him something else entirely. To understand the man, you have to begin long before the Senate floor, long before the speeches, long before the headlines. You have to go back to Ohio. Back to instability, back to chaos, back to a childhood shaped by addiction, poverty, and unpredictability. He was born James David Vance in 1984 in Middletown, Ohio, a steel town struggling under the weight of industrial decline. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, families were fracturing. His early life was not polished, it was not privileged. His mother battled addiction, his home life was unstable, he moved between households. At times, it was his grandmother who provided structure, discipline mixed with fierce loyalty. In interviews and in his memoir, he would later describe this world as one filled with pain, violence, and dysfunction, but also resilience. This background would become central to his identity. Because long before politics, there was a story. And that story would change everything. In 2016, he published a memoir about growing up in working-class America. The book struck a nerve. It arrived during a volatile political moment. America was divided. Rural and working-class communities felt ignored. Cultural frustration was rising. Suddenly, this young man from Ohio was not just an author. He was being called an interpreter of America's white working class. Media outlets invited him to speak. Panels, interviews, commentary. He was thoughtful, analytical, sometimes critical of political movements gaining traction at the time. And this is where the first tension begins. Because early public statements from him did not align with the political identity he would later embrace. At that time, he expressed skepticism toward populist politics. He questioned rhetoric. He analyzed movements from a distance. But politics moves quickly. And so do ambitions. Over the next few years, something shifted. He transitioned from commentator to candidate, from observer to participant. He ran for the United States Senate in Ohio. His messaging evolved. His tone sharpened. His alliances changed. Supporters argue this was growth, a man adjusting his views as he entered the arena. Critics argue it was something else, a strategic pivot toward power. In modern American politics, reinvention is not rare. But the speed and scale of transformation often raises eyebrows. How does someone move from critic to ally? From distance to loyalty? From analysis to alignment? For some voters, it showed maturity. For others, it looked like contradiction. And contradiction is where narratives are born. When he campaigned for Senate, he leaned heavily into themes of nationalism, cultural decline, economic frustration, and distrust of elite institutions. These themes resonated deeply with many Ohio voters. He won. And with that victory, he transitioned from storyteller to lawmaker. From describing forgotten America to representing it. Inside the Senate, he positioned himself as a voice skeptical of foreign intervention, critical of corporate power, and vocal about cultural issues shaping the American debate. But the question continued to follow him. Was this evolution sincere? Or strategic? Politics is not static. Views change, coalitions shift, leaders adapt. But in the age of digital archives, past words never disappear. Old interviews resurfaced, past tweets were quoted, media comparisons circulated. To his supporters, the criticism was unfair. Everyone grows, they argued. To his critics, it was evidence of opportunism. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Because human beings are complicated. And ambition, especially in politics, is rarely simple. There is also the religious dimension. Faith became an increasingly visible part of his public identity. His conversion to Catholicism was widely discussed. He spoke about morality, family structure, cultural decay. For some Americans, this strengthened his credibility. For others, it intensified scrutiny. When faith intersects with politics, expectations rise. Consistency becomes not just political, but moral. And when critics see inconsistencies, they frame them not as strategy, but as hypocrisy. This is where perception becomes powerful. In modern America, image is almost as important as policy. A politician's narrative can elevate them, or trap them. JD Vance's narrative is one of ascent. From instability to Ivy League education. From Marine Corps service to Yale Law School. From memoirist to venture capitalist. From commentator to United States Senator.
It is, undeniably, a story of upward mobility. But upward mobility in politics invites suspicion. Who are you loyal to? Where do you truly stand? What do you really believe? And perhaps the deeper question, is change a sign of growth or calculation? In interviews, he has framed several his imbuswining from experience, seeing the system from the inside, understanding what truly matters. But critics highlight earlier statements that seem to contradict later positions. This tension is not unique to him. It is a reflection of a broader American phenomenon, the clash between authenticity and ambition. In a polarized country, shifting views are rarely forgiven. Yet rigid consistency is rarely rewarded. So politicians walk a tightrope. Adjust too little, you become irrelevant. Adjust too much, you become suspect. JD Vance's career sits precisely on that line. And as national attention increasingly turns toward figures who represent the next generation of political leadership, scrutiny intensifies. Because the question is no longer just about Ohio. It is about the future of American conservatism. Is it populist? Is it nationalist? Is it institutional? Or is it something still forming? And where exactly does he stand within it? The man who once analyzed power from the outside is now inside the machine. And history shows that once inside, compromise becomes unavoidable. So is he a product of the system? Or reshaping it? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. Supporters see a man who overcame hardship, understands forgotten communities, and fights cultural battles they believe deeply. Critics see calculated repositioning, ideological flexibility, and ambition masked as conviction. In politics, perception becomes reality, and narratives harden quickly. But here is the deeper truth. American politics has always been full of reinvention. Abraham Lincoln changed parties. Ronald Reagan once supported Democrats before leading Republicans. Barack Obama shifted positions on major issues over time. Transformation is not new. The question is intent. And intent is the hardest thing to prove. As his career continues, the debate around him will likely intensify. Because in today's media environment, every past statement becomes ammunition. Every evolution becomes evidence. Every alliance becomes a headline. The boy from Middletown became a national figure,
the victory speech
but with elevation comes exposure.
After the applause
and in
dies
exposure,
down,
contradictions become
after
magnified.
the cameras turn off,
Whether history will view him as a
power
principled
stops
reformer,
being
a pragmatic
theory.
strategist,
It
or
becomes
something in between,
responsibility.
remains unwritten.
When JD
But one thing
Vance
is certain.
entered the United States
His story is
Senate,
not just about him.
the outsider narrative
It is about modern
faced
America,
its first real test.
about mobility,
Campaign trails
about identity,
are emotional,
about
speeches
belief,
are symbolic,
about power,
but the Senate floor
and about
is
the thin line
procedural,
between conviction and
strategic,
ambition.
and unforgiving.
This is only the beginning.
The transformation
Because the
from
next chapter is not
candidate
about
to
where he came
lawmaker
from.
is where
It
ideals
is about where he is
collide with
going.
reality.
And in American
reality
politics,
in
the
Washington
climb is never
is
finished.
rarely simple. Inside the Capitol, alliances matter, committees matter, party discipline matters. Votes are recorded. Every position becomes traceable. The man who once described America's forgotten communities now had to decide how to vote on policies that directly affected them: economic policy, foreign policy, cultural legislation, corporate regulation. Every issue carried consequences. Supporters expected disruption. Critics expected conformity. Which path would he choose? One of the defining themes of his Senate presence became skepticism toward foreign intervention. He questioned large overseas spending packages and emphasized domestic priorities. This aligned with a growing faction within American conservatism that argued for a more restrained global role. To some, this was consistency, reflecting his earlier criticisms of elite institutions disconnected from working-class realities. To others, it was political positioning within an evolving party identity. Because the Republican Party itself was changing, the old guard emphasized free markets, global alliances, and institutional conservatism. A newer faction emphasized nationalism, economic protectionism, and cultural confrontation. Where did he fit? Observers noticed that he spoke confidently about industrial decline, supply chains, and cultural fragmentation. His messaging was focused, deliberate, media-ready. This was not accidental. He understood narrative power. His memoir had proven that storytelling could influence national conversation. Now, as a senator, he blended policy with narrative, framing votes not just as legislative acts but as moral positions. And that is where scrutiny intensified. Because moral framing invites higher standards. If you present policy as ethical necessity, critics will examine every detail of consistency. One recurring criticism centered on his earlier public statements about political figures he later aligned with. Archived interviews showed skepticism. Later appearances showed support. Supporters called it reflection, a reassessment after witnessing political dynamics firsthand. Critics labeled it opportunism, a strategic recalibration to align with dominant forces. But politics is not static. Consider this. Entering government exposes complexities invisible from the outside. Policies that appear simple during commentary often reveal layers of constraint when confronted with classified briefings, committee realities, and negotiation limits.
Is it possible that proximity changes perspective? Yes. Is it possible that ambition shapes perspective? Also yes. The truth is rarely binary. Another dimension of his evolution was intellectual framing. He often cited broader cultural trends, declining birth rates, erosion of family structures, distrust in institutions. These themes resonated strongly with certain voter blocs. They also triggered strong opposition from others who viewed such framing as overly pessimistic or exclusionary. In modern politics, tone can be as influential as content. Some Americans saw urgency in his rhetoric. Others saw exaggeration. Media amplification magnified both reactions. Cable news thrives on polarization. Social media thrives on conflict. Nuanced evolution does not trend easily, so narratives hardened. He was either a principal realist or a calculated climber. But beneath public perception lies another question. What motivates long-term political behavior? Is it ideology, identity, electoral math, or legacy? For someone who experienced instability early in life, security and influence may carry personal significance. Climbing from economic uncertainty to national office is not a small arc. Ambition in that context can feel like survival. Yet public office invites a paradox. The more influence you gain, the more your authenticity is questioned, especially if your earlier statements contrast with current alliances. This tension reflects something larger than one individual. It reflects the modern American condition, where digital memory preserves every version of ourselves. Imagine being defined forever by opinions you held before entering the arena. Imagine being denied the possibility of recalibration. Politics punishes inconsistency, but it also punishes rigidity. Navigating that contradiction requires strategic intelligence, and by most accounts, he possesses that. Observers across ideological lines acknowledge his articulation, media discipline, and strategic awareness. He rarely appears unprepared. He rarely strays far from messaging priorities. That level of control signals calculation, but calculation is not inherently negative. It can reflect professionalism. Still, critics argue that the transformation from cultural commentator to party-aligned senator happened too quickly to be purely organic. Was the shift gradual or abrupt? Was it intellectual or electoral? History may answer, or it may remain contested, because political legacy is written long after speeches fade. Another factor shaping perception is generational positioning. He is younger than many traditional party leaders. That matters. Younger politicians often serve as bridges between ideological eras. They inherit frameworks but must adapt them to new realities. The American conservative movement itself is in transition, balancing economic populism with traditional market principles, balancing cultural urgency with institutional stability. Figures like JD Vance sit at the intersection of that shift, which makes them symbols, whether they choose to be or not. Symbolism amplifies scrutiny. Every vote becomes evidence. Every interview becomes signal. Even silence becomes interpreted. As debates around technology regulation, corporate influence, and cultural policy intensify, his positioning will likely face new tests, because ideology solidifies not in rhetoric, but in sustained behavior. If positions remain consistent over time, accusations of opportunism weaken. If they shift again, criticism strengthens. Time is the ultimate judge of political sincerity. But American media cycles move faster than time allows, so narratives form early, and early narratives can define careers. Yet there is something undeniably compelling about reinvention stories. America itself was built on reinvention. From frontier settlers to industrial magnates to Silicon Valley founders, transformation is embedded in national mythology. So why does political reinvention provoke suspicion? Perhaps because power raises stakes. When reinvention leads to influence over laws, budgets, and national direction, the public demands clarity. Are you guided by principle or by opportunity? In reality, most political careers contain elements of both. Idealism fuels entry. Pragmatism sustains survival. The balance between them defines legacy. As his Senate tenure continues, observers will measure patterns. Does he prioritize rhetoric or legislative craftsmanship? Does he build coalitions or deepen divides? Does he compromise strategically or hold firm? These questions will shape how historians categorize him, because history is less interested in viral moments and more interested in sustained trajectory. The man from Middletown once analyzed America's fractures. Now he operates within them. Whether he ultimately bridges them or sharpens them remains uncertain. But one thing is undeniable. He understands narrative power. And in modern politics, narrative can be as potent as policy.
But sometimes
the next chapter will not be about childhood hardship or campaign shifts. It will be about endurance.
When observers try
because
to
political
understand
careers are
political
marathons, not sprints.
transformation,
Early
they often
contradictions may
focus
fade,
on public
or they may
statements,
define. And
interviews,
as national attention
tweets,
increasingly turns toward the future
speeches,
of American leadership,
campaign ads.
figures like him will stand
But
at
the
the center
more
of that
revealing
debate,
layer sits
not
beneath
simply
all
as
of that.
individuals, but as
Incentives.
reflections of a country still arguing with itself.
Politics is
This
not
story is
just
still unfolding.
ideology.
And in
It is
politics,
structure.
the most revealing
It is
chapters are
reward
often the ones
systems.
written slowly,
It is alliances
through votes,
that determine
alliances,
survival.
and decisions that do not trend,
For
but
someone
endure.
who rose from instability into elite institutions, the Marine Corps, Yale Law School, venture capital, adaptation was already part of his life before he entered the Senate. Adaptation is not betrayal, it is a skill. The question is whether that skill serves principle or ambition. To understand this tension, consider the cultural moment in which he emerged. Post-2016 America was not the same country it had been a decade earlier. Institutions were distrusted. Media credibility was questioned. Working-class frustration had become a dominant political force. His memoir resonated because it translated cultural pain into accessible language. It framed economic decline not just as policy failure, but as identity fracture. That framing positioned him uniquely. He was not a lifelong politician. He was not a television personality. He was an interpreter. Interpreters occupy interesting space in politics. They are trusted by audiences who feel misunderstood. But once they step from explanation into governance, they risk becoming part of the system they once critiqued, and that shift is rarely smooth. In Washington, legislative compromise is inevitable. Even the most ideologically committed lawmakers must negotiate, vote strategically, and accept partial victories. For someone whose public persona was rooted in cultural clarity, navigating that compromise required careful calibration. Too much compromise, and supporters feel betrayed. Too little compromise, and effectiveness diminishes. This balancing act defines modern political survival. Critics often point to earlier interviews in which he questioned certain political leaders or expressed skepticism towards movements he later aligned with. Those clips circulate frequently in digital spaces. Supporters counter with a simple argument. Exposure changes perspective. From outside the system, political rhetoric may appear chaotic or misguided. From inside, the calculus may look different. Information changes context. Access changes understanding. But there is another explanation critics raise. Power reshapes incentives. When running for Senate, primary elections often reward alignment with the dominant ideological wing of the party. General elections require broader appeal. Navigating both requires strategic messaging. Is strategic messaging hypocrisy? Or is it politics? That depends largely on one's expectations of political purity. American history offers countless examples of leaders whose positions evolve dramatically over time. Some evolutions are celebrated, others are condemned. The difference often lies in narrative framing, and narrative framing is rarely neutral. As his national profile increased, so did the intensity of scrutiny. Interviews became sharper, questions more pointed. Journalists revisited past statements more frequently. He responded with reframing. Rather than denying earlier criticism outright, he often suggested that events had reshaped his understanding, that experience had altered his interpretation of political dynamics. Whether that explanation satisfies depends on the listener's predisposition. In polarized environments, audiences rarely evaluate in isolation. They interpret through ideological lenses. Another dimension often overlooked is generational ambition. He is part of a cohort of younger politicians seeking to define the next era of conservative politics. That ambition requires differentiation, distinguishing oneself from older establishment figures while maintaining institutional viability. That dual objective produces tension. Too radical and institutional power structures resist. Too moderate and grassroots enthusiasm fades. Navigating that corridor requires discipline. Observers frequently note his composure. He rarely appears emotionally reactive in public settings. His delivery is measured, controlled, deliberate. That presentation reinforces perceptions of calculation. But calculation is not synonymous with deception. In competitive political systems, preparation is survival. There is also the cultural layer. His rhetoric often centers around themes of family stability, economic nationalism, and skepticism toward corporate influence. These themes resonate strongly with segments of the elect who feel economically and culturally displaced. In that sense, his positioning aligns with broader structural trends within American conservatism. The debate is not whether he reflects those themes, it is whether he arrived at them organically or strategically. That question may never have a definitive answer, because personal conviction and political strategy are not mutually exclusive. They often overlap. It is entirely possible for a politician to sincerely believe in certain themes while also recognizing their electoral potency. Human motivation is layered. Simplistic labels rarely capture it. As his Senate career progresses, legislative patterns will provide stronger indicators than campaign rhetoric ever could. Voting records reveal priorities. Coalition patterns reveal alliances. Committee focus reveals long-term vision. These slow-moving indicators matter more than viral clips. Yet viral clips dominate perception. That is the paradox of modern politics. Visibility often outweighs substance. Still, long-term reputations are shaped by endurance. If positions remain steady over years, accusations of opportunism lose force. If further shifts occur, critics gain ammunition. At this stage, his political identity remains information. He stands at an intersection of intellectual conservatism and populist energy. How that intersection resolves will define his trajectory. And perhaps more importantly, it will signal where American conservatism itself is heading. Because individual politicians often become proxies for ideological transitions. When a party evolves, certain figures symbolize that evolution. Whether intentionally or not, he has become one of those symbols. Symbolism invites projection. Supporters project hope. Critics project suspicion. The truth, as usual, resides in complexity. There is another factor rarely discussed openly. Fear of irrelevance. Political careers can stall quickly. Media attention fades. Donor networks shift. Primary challengers emerge. Remaining influential requires adaptation. Adaptation does not always mean abandonment of principle, but it does mean recalibration. The American political landscape rewards visibility. It rewards clarity. It rewards narrative simplicity. Yet governing demands nuance. Balancing those competing demands is the central tension of modern political life. From Middletown instability to Senate authority, the arc of his life is undeniably dramatic. But drama alone does not define legacy. Legacy is defined by durability. Will he remain ideologically consistent over a decade? Will he seek higher office? Will he pivot again as national circumstances shift? These are open questions. And open questions fuel documentary narratives. Because unresolved tension keeps audiences watching. Not for scandal, but for trajectory.
This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a system that rewards transformation and punishes it at the same time. A system that demands authenticity while incentivizing adaptation. A system where every word is archived and every shift analyzed. In that environment, maintaining perfect consistency may be impossible, but maintaining coherent direction is essential. The coming years will test that coherence. Economic volatility, cultural polarization, technological disruption, global uncertainty. Each pressure point will demand response. Each response will either reinforce perception or reshape it. History rarely remembers early contradictions if later chapters demonstrate stability.
Ambition
But if
is
instability
rarely
persists,
loud.
early
It
contradictions
does
become
not
defining
always
traits.
announce
For now,
itself.
the narrative remains unfinished.
Sometimes
He's not a
it
retired
looks like
statesman reflecting on
discipline.
decades of impact. He's an
Sometimes
active
it looks
participant in
like
unfolding
patience.
history, which means the final
Sometimes
assessment
it
remains
looks
suspended.
like silence.
And perhaps that suspension is the most honest
In
place to leave the
American
story for now.
politics,
Because in
the
politics,
loudest
certainty is
figures
often
dominate
premature,
headlines.
and transformation is
But
rarely linear.
often it is
The
the
boy from
quieter
Ohio entered the
ones who
forest of
move
American power.
carefully,
Unlike the
building
quiet trail from
positioning
earlier
rather
chapters,
than
this
spectacle.
forest is crowded, strategic,
JD
relentless,
Vance entered
and in this
national
forest,
politics
no one
during a
simply walks
moment
through
of
unchanged.
ideological realignment. The Republican Party was redefining itself. The old vocabulary of free trade, interventionism, and institutional conservatism was being challenged by a new language, one centered on economic nationalism, cultural protection, and skepticism of elite consensus. He did not create that shift, but he stepped into it at the right time. Timing matters in politics. History is full of intelligent people who arrive too early or too late. Arriving during a transition allows a figure to shape identity while the boundaries are still fluid, and fluid boundaries create opportunity. When he speaks about economic decline, about small towns left behind, about families struggling with addiction and instability, he draws from lived narrative. That authenticity cannot be fabricated. But authenticity in one domain does not automatically translate into consistency in all domains. This is where complexity intensifies. A man can genuinely believe in cultural renewal while also calculating electoral advantage. A politician can sincerely hold convictions while recognizing which framing amplifies influence. The tension between belief and strategy is not contradiction, it is coexistence. Still, public trust depends on perceived alignment between past and present. In an era of archived footage and searchable interviews, evolution is visible in high resolution. Old skepticism toward political figures who later become allies raises natural questions. Was it misjudgment before, or recalculation later? Supporters often frame such shifts as maturation. They argue that political outsiders lack full information, that once inside government, access to intelligence, policy briefings, and institutional realities reshapes understanding. There is truth to that argument. Information changes perspective. But critics counter that alignment often correlates suspiciously with opportunity. That skepticism fades precisely when endorsement strengthens electoral viability. That argument also contains logic. So the real inquiry becomes less about whether change occurred, because it clearly did, and more about why. Motivation is invisible. Only patterns are visible. Patterns take time. As Senate years accumulate, voting records will tell a more stable story than campaign speeches ever could. Will economic nationalism remain central? Will foreign policy restraint persist? Will cultural rhetoric soften or intensify? Consistency across multiple election cycles will answer what interviews cannot. Another dimension often overlooked is peer influence. Political environments exert gravitational pull. Committee memberships, donor networks, staff ecosystems, they shape worldview incrementally. No senator operates in isolation. Exposure to colleagues, strategists, think tanks, and party leadership gradually refines positioning. Is adaptation in that environment surrender or learning? That depends on philosophical expectation. Some voters demand immovable rigidity. Others value responsiveness to new evidence. But the American electorate is not monolithic. Different constituencies reward different behaviors. This creates cross-pressure. In Ohio, economic anxiety and industrial nostalgia resonate strongly. In national politics, broader coalitions require calibration. Balancing state identity with national ambition requires strategic awareness. And ambition itself is a controversial word. In everyday life, ambition is celebrated. In politics, ambition is suspect. Why? Because ambition implies desire for power, and power demands accountability. If ambition appears detached from principle, distrust grows. If ambition appears rooted in narrative consistency, support are celebrated. Which side dominates often depends less on facts and more on framing ecosystems. Modern media ecosystems are fragmented. Conservative media often frames him as articulate, intellectually grounded, and representative of working-class revival. Progressive media often frames him as emblematic of ideological opportunism and populist recalibration. Both narratives coexist, and audiences choose which narrative to trust. That duality is not unique to him. It defines contemporary American politics. But his trajectory embodies it clearly.
He is young enough to represent generational shift, experienced enough to claim institutional legitimacy, articulate enough to navigate interviews without dramatic missteps. That combination increases visibility. Visibility increases scrutiny. Scrutiny increases polarization. Polarization increases narrative rigidity. And narrative rigidity often precedes national ambition, which leads to the next unspoken question. Is the Senate the destination or a stepping stone? Political careers often follow arcs: local recognition, state-level office, national influence, potential executive aspiration. Speculation about higher office naturally emerges around younger, articulate senators. Whether justified or premature, such speculation reshapes perception. A senator viewed as long-term legislative contributor is evaluated differently than one perceived as presidential material. Presidential trajectories invite intensified analysis of character consistency. Every past interview becomes campaign material, either supportive or critical. Every pivot becomes debate fodder. In that context, maintaining coherent narrative is essential. Coherent does not require immobility, but it requires thematic stability. So far, his thematic focus on economic anxiety, cultural fragmentation, and skepticism toward elite structures has remained relatively consistent in tone. The debate centers not on themes, but on alliances. And alliances in politics often determine trajectory more than ideology alone. Strategic alignment with influential figures can accelerate visibility dramatically, but it also fuses identity to broader political currents beyond individual control. If those currents strengthen, association amplifies power. If they weaken, association constrains flexibility. Political calculation must account for both possibilities. This is where long-term strategy becomes more visible than short-term rhetoric. Is positioning anchored to momentary dominance, or adaptable to future recalibration? The answer remains unfolding. Another layer of analysis concerns intellectual branding. He is often described as more policy-oriented than purely performative figures. He references economic structures, demographic data, cultural theory. That intellectual framing appeals to audiences seeking substance over spectacle. But intellectualism can also create expectations of consistency. The more analytical a politician appears, the less tolerance audiences have for apparent contradiction. Because analysis implies deliberation. Deliberation implies intentionality. Intentionality intensifies scrutiny of change. And so we return to the central tension. Is evolution evidence of reflection or recalibration? Perhaps the deeper reality is this. Modern politics does not allow static identity. Information cycles move rapidly. Voter sentiment shifts. Economic crises emerge. Geopolitical events disrupt. Rigid ideology can fracture under pressure. Adaptive ideology can appear unstable. Navigating that paradox defines political survival. And survival is not trivial. Many commentators fade after initial visibility. Remaining relevant requires continuous engagement. Continuous engagement requires narrative renewal. The boy who once described community decline now stands within institutions attempting to address it. That transition alone alters perspective. Critiquing a system from outside carries moral clarity. Operating within it reveals structural constraint. Budgets are negotiated. Bills are amended. Votes are traded. Purity confronts procedure. And procedure often wins. Does that dilute conviction? Or does it reveal realism? Perhaps both. In American political history, figures once accused of inconsistency later became respected statesmen, precisely because they demonstrated ability to adapt while retaining thematic focus. Others became cautionary tales of overcalculation. The dividing line between those outcomes is often subtle. It lies in whether voters perceive growth as sincere. And sincerity, paradoxically, is measured not by rhetoric but by endurance. If future years reveal stability in core themes, economic prioritization of domestic industry, cultural emphasis on family structures, skepticism toward institutional overreach, accusations of opportunism may fade. If future years reveal further dramatic shifts, criticism will intensify. Time, not commentary, will decide. For now, the narrative remains dynamic. He represents a broader question facing America. Can political figures evolve without being condemned? Can ambition coexist with authenticity?
It lingers.
Can reinvention be genuine?
Because the story isn't really about
These questions
one man.
extend beyond one
It's
individual.
about America's hunger
They
for
speak to a digital
outsiders,
era where
and
personal
what
history is
happens when
permanent,
outsiders become
where
insiders.
ideological migration is archived,
After the book tours
where change
ended
is
and the
suspect.
television interviews
And
slowed,
yet, change is
the real
inevitable.
transformation began.
The American political
The
system
man who
rewards
once
resilience.
described the struggles
It
of
rewards
forgotten
narrative
towns
control.
now had a
It rewards
platform that
timing.
reached millions.
And above all, it
The
rewards
memoir
those who
had made him
understand
the
that
voice
perception
of
often
working
shapes
class
reality
America.
as strongly as policy
But
does.
politics would demand
The
something
climb
different.
continues. The scrutiny
Politics demands
continues.
alignment.
The debate
It
continues.
demands loyalty.
And somewhere
It
between
demands
conviction and calculation,
In the
a
years that
long-term
followed,
identity is
his
still being
public
written.
language shifted. The tone sharpened. The criticism softened in some directions and intensified in others. The outsider who once challenged power structures began navigating them. Was it growth? Was it strategy? Or was it survival? In American politics, those three often look the same. The rise wasn't accidental, it was methodical. Appearances increased, messaging refined, alliances formed quietly before they became visible publicly. In a political era dominated by spectacle, he learned the rhythm of headlines. Supporters saw evolution, critics saw contradiction. But in politics, perception is the battlefield. When he entered the Senate race, the stakes changed. Campaign trails replaced book signings, donors replaced publishers, and every past statement became searchable. Old interviews resurfaced, old opinions replayed. The internet doesn't forget, especially in politics. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. The American electorate was shifting. Anger was currency. Authenticity, or the performance of it, was power. He positioned himself not just as a candidate, but as a bridge between two Americas, the forgotten industrial towns and the national conservative movement. That balancing act is never simple. Every speech had two audiences. Every statement carried weight beyond its words. In rallies, he spoke of loyalty, faith, strength, and national identity. In interviews, he spoke of policy, economics, and strategic priorities. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. And that's where the real documentary tension lives, not in accusations, but in evolution. Because here's the deeper question your audience will stay for. What happens when someone who once diagnosed the system decides to become part of it? Is it betrayal, or is it ambition finally meeting opportunity? Power changes people, but sometimes people chase power because they believe they can change it. The Senate chamber is quiet compared to campaign rallies. There are no chants, no roaring applause, just negotiation, influence, strategy. In Washington, survival requires alliances, and alliances require compromise. The man who once wrote about dysfunction now operated inside the most complex political machine in the world. Supporters called it leadership. Opponents called it calculation. But the truth? The truth in politics is rarely clean. As national attention returned, so did scrutiny. Every vote analyzed, every public appearance dissected. Cable news panels debated his trajectory as if it were symbolic of something larger. Because it was. His rise reflected a broader American pattern, the elevation of voices that claimed to challenge elites, only to eventually stand among them. That paradox fuels modern politics, and it fuels your documentary tension. The camera should slow here. Music softens. Narration deepens. Because this isn't just about one politician. It's about reinvention. It's about whether America rewards consistency or rewards alignment with power. And then comes the bigger stage. National speculation. Vice presidential whispers. The shift from state politics to national ambition. In politics, timing is everything. The right message at the right moment can redefine a career. And suddenly the arc feels complete. From small-town hardship, to best-selling author, to senator, to national figure. The American ladder climbed step by step, but every rung leaves fingerprints. And your documentary's final act shouldn't answer the question. It should ask it. Did he change? Or did the stage change him? Was the evolution ideological or strategic? And here's the powerful closing hook for your viewers. In America, we don't just elect leaders. We create them. We amplify them. We argue about them. And in doing so, we shape what they become. The story isn't finished. It's unfolding. Right now. The camera doesn't cut. It lingers. Because the story isn't really about one man. It's about America's hunger for outsiders and what happens when outsiders become insiders. After the book tours ended and the television interviews slowed, the real transformation began. The man who once described the struggles of forgotten towns now had a platform that reached millions. The memoir had made him a voice of working-class America, but politics would demand something different. Politics demands alignment. It demands loyalty. It demands calculation. In the years that followed, his public language shifted. The tone sharpened. The criticism softened in some directions and intensified in others. The outsider who once challenged power structures began navigating them. Was it growth? Was it strategy? Or was it survival? In American politics, those three often look the same. The rise wasn't accidental. It was methodical. Appearances increased, messaging refined, alliances formed quietly before they became visible publicly. In a political era dominated by spectacle, he learned the rhythm of headlines. Supporters saw evolution. Critics saw contradiction. But in politics, perception is the battlefield. When he entered the Senate race, the stakes changed.
Campaign trails replaced book signings, donors replaced publishers, and every past statement became searchable. Old interviews resurfaced, old opinions replayed. The internet doesn't forget, especially in politics. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. The American electorate was shifting. Anger was currency. Authenticity, or the performance of it, was power. He positioned himself not just as a candidate, but as a bridge between two Americas, the forgotten industrial towns and the national conservative movement. That balancing act is never simple. Every speech had two audiences. Every statement carried weight beyond its words. In rallies, he spoke of loyalty, faith, strength, and national identity. In interviews, he spoke of policy, economics, and strategic priorities. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. And that's where the real documentary tension lives, not in accusations, but in evolution. Because here's the deeper question your audience will stay for. What happens when someone who once diagnosed the system decides to become part of it? Is it betrayal? Or is it ambition finally meeting opportunity? Power changes people, but sometimes people chase power because they believe they can change it. The Senate chamber is quiet compared to campaign rallies. There are no chants, no roaring applause, just negotiation, influence, strategy. In Washington, survival requires alliances, and alliances require compromise. The man who once wrote about dysfunction now operated inside the most complex political machine in the world. Supporters called it leadership. Opponents called it calculation. But the truth? The truth in politics is rarely clean. As national attention returned, so did scrutiny. Every vote analyzed, every public appearance dissected. Cable news panels debated his trajectory as if it were symbolic of something larger. Because it was. His rise reflected a broader American pattern, the elevation of voices that claim to challenge elites, only to eventually stand among them. That paradox fuels modern politics, and it fuels your documentary tension. The camera should slow here. Music softens. Narration deepens. Because this isn't just about one politician. It's about reinvention. It's about whether America rewards consistency or rewards alignment with power. And then comes the bigger stage, national speculation, vice presidential whispers, the shift from state politics to national ambition. In politics, timing is everything. The right message at the right moment can redefine a career. And suddenly the arc feels complete. From small-town hardship, to best-selling author, to senator, to national figure. The American ladder climbed step by step, but every rung leaves fingerprints. And your documentary's final act shouldn't answer the question. It should ask it. Did he change? Or did the stage change him? Was the evolution ideological or strategic? And here's the powerful closing hook for your viewers. In America, we don't just elect leaders. We create them. We amplify them. We argue about them. And in doing so, we shape what they become. The story isn't finished. It's unfolding. Right now.